She slid the papers across the table like she was doing me a favor. Thick, bound, my name printed at the top in clean black ink, like they'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Her lawyer sat beside her, pen already uncapped. "Sign it," she said, "or leave my son." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Margaret Holloway had spent years perfecting the kind of quiet that made people shrink, the kind that didn't need volume because it carried weight, the weight of a woman who had watched her son build something she never believed he could, and had decided, very quietly, that it now belonged to her. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at her, and I almost smiled, because what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting there in that dining room with her lawyer and her confidence and her perfectly pressed blouse, was that 2 FBI agents were already in the building, and they weren't there for me. Before I tell you what happened that night, take a second and hit that like button. And if you're new here, subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. My name is Claire, and if you want to understand that dining room, if you want to understand why I was sitting across from my mother-in-law with a federal investigation already in motion and my entire future already secured, then you need to know where I started, because I didn't start anywhere near that table. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, middle of nowhere. My father worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, a warehouse during the week, a grocery store on weekends. My mother cleaned houses, not because they were lazy, not because they didn't have ambition, but because life had handed them a narrow road and they walked it with everything they had. I watched them do that my whole life, and I made myself one promise. I was going to walk a wider road. I put myself through community college first, then transferred on a partial scholarship to finish my business degree. I worked nights at a call center to pay rent. I wore the same 3 pairs of shoes for 2 years. I graduated with honors and a resume built entirely on hustle, and I walked into the job market with nothing behind me, except the belief that I could figure it out. And I did. By 27, I had a steady income, a small savings account, and a 1-bedroom apartment that was mine. No family money, no safety net, just Claire and what Claire had built. That's who I was when I met Daniel Holloway. And that matters, because that's exactly what Margaret never wanted to admit. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was sitting at the far end of the table, quiet in a way that wasn't shy, more like someone who had gotten used to taking up less space than he deserved. He was 31, he was working a warehouse job he was overqualified for, he drove a car with a cracked windshield he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. When the check came, I watched him do the quiet mental math that people do when they're not sure they can cover their share, and I said nothing and split it evenly without making it a thing. On the walk to the parking lot, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. We talked for another hour leaning against my car. I found out that night what had happened to him. Daniel's mother, Margaret, had come from old money, not generational wealth, but enough for a big house and a good neighborhood, enough for connections, enough to make a certain kind of life look effortless from the outside. When Daniel's father died, Margaret inherited everything, and instead of using it to stabilize her family, she used it to stabilize her image. Charity dinners, a wardrobe, a social circle that required maintenance. She kept up appearances so aggressively that by the time Daniel was 24 and needed help launching a small business idea he'd been developing for 2 years, a logistics consulting firm, genuinely good idea, solid plan, she told him she didn't have the capital. He found out later that wasn't true. When he pushed back, when he asked her directly why she wouldn't help him, she told him he was being naive, that his idea would fail, that he needed to get a real job and stop dreaming. He left his house that year with 2 bags and a broken something behind his eyes that he'd spent years learning to hide. By the time I met him, he hadn't spoken to his mother in 14 months. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've heard the version of this story where the woman saves the man, and I don't think that's quite right. I didn't save Daniel. Daniel saved himself. What I did was stand next to him while he did it. We started dating 3 months after that dinner. 6 months in, we were talking seriously about the future. His logistics idea was still alive. He'd been keeping it on the back burner while working the warehouse job, refining it, researching, waiting for a moment that felt right. I had savings. Not a lot, but enough to matter. I said, "Let's do it." He looked at me like I had said something in a language he didn't fully speak yet. He said, "You do that?" I said, "We'd do it. There's a difference." The first 2 years were hard in the way that building something real is always hard. We worked out of a shared office space with secondhand desks. I kept my full-time job and managed the books for the business at night. Daniel ran operations, did client calls, drove to meetings in that car with the cracked windshield that we finally fixed in year 1, when we had enough to justify it. We didn't take vacations. We ate at home. We reinvested everything. I remember a specific Tuesday in year 2. We'd just lost a client we'd spent 3 months courting, and we were sitting on the kitchen floor eating cereal for dinner because neither of us had the energy to cook. And Daniel said, "I'm sorry, you shouldn't have to live like this." And I looked at him and I said, "Stop apologizing for building something. Apologize when you quit." He never quit. By year 3, the business had 2 full-time employees and its first 6-figure contract. By year 4, we had moved into a real office, bought a house, and Daniel's name was starting to mean something in the industry. By year 5, Daniel Holloway was wealthy. And that is the exact moment his mother called. I remember the night the phone rang. We were sitting on the back porch, a porch we had chosen together, in a house we had bought together, in a life we had constructed from nothing together. Daniel looked at the screen. His face changed. "It's my mom," he said. I watched him answer it. I watched the way his shoulders shifted as she spoke. Something softened in him that I hadn't seen before, or maybe something that had always been there, waiting for permission to come back. The little boy who had wanted his mother and never stopped wanting her, no matter what she'd done. I understood it, I did. What I didn't understand yet was what she was calling to collect. Margaret came to dinner the following weekend. She was charming, warm in a way I hadn't expected. She complimented the house, asked Daniel questions about the business with what sounded like genuine pride. And at the end of the evening, she hugged me at the door and said, "Thank you for taking care of him." I smiled. I told myself I'd been wrong about her. I want to go back and shake myself. The shift in Daniel was gradual at first. That's how these things work. It doesn't happen all at once. If it did, you'd see it clearly and you'd know what you were dealing with. Instead, it happens in degrees. A small withdrawal, a change in tone, a way of listening to his mother that started to resemble the way he used to listen to me. Margaret started coming to dinner every week, then twice a week. Then she was calling Daniel in the evenings, long calls, an hour sometimes, that he'd take in the other room. I asked him once, gently, what they talked about so much. "Just catching up," he said. I let it go, but I was paying attention. I noticed the first real crack about 6 months after Margaret came back. We were discussing expanding the business, a second location, something we'd been planning together for over a year. I had the numbers, the projections, everything mapped out. We sat down to go over it, and halfway through, Daniel said, "My mom thinks we should hold off." I put my pen down. "Your mom," I said. "She has experience with investments," he said. "She thinks the timing isn't right." I looked at him for a long moment. "Daniel," I said carefully, "your mother has never run a business. We built this together. This decision is ours." He looked away. "I'm just saying we should consider what she thinks." That was the beginning of the end. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere in me, something quiet and careful woke up. Over the next several months, I watched Margaret work. She was good at it, patient. She didn't come in loud or obvious. She came in soft. A word here, a suggestion there, a comment planted like a seed and left to grow. She started telling Daniel in ways I wasn't supposed to hear that I was controlling, that I had too much involvement in the business, that a man of his standing needed a partner who complemented him, not one who competed with him. She started mentioning other women, casually. "Daniel, you remember so-and-so's daughter? She's doing so well now." Little things, persistent things. And Daniel, who had eaten cereal on a kitchen floor with me, Daniel whose cracked windshield I had helped fix, Daniel who had looked at me on a porch 5 years ago like I was the reason things might actually work out, Daniel started to change. He stopped asking my opinion on business decisions. He stopped reaching for my hand at dinner.
He started arriving home late without explanation, and when I asked, he looked at me with an impatience he'd never had before, like I was an inconvenience he was managing rather than a person he loved. One night, I heard him on the phone with his mother. I wasn't eavesdropping, I was walking past the door to get a glass of water, but I heard him say clearly, quietly, "I know, Mom, I know, I'm working on it." I went back to bed and I lay in the dark for a long time. And then I got up, went to my desk, and I started making calls of my own.
The first call was to an attorney named Patricia Webb. Patricia was recommended to me by a colleague, a woman who had been through her own version of this and come out the other side standing. Patricia specialized in asset protection and family law, and when I sat across from her in her office and laid out everything, the business, the house, the accounts, the shift in Daniel's behavior, the mother, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "How much of this is in your name?" I told her. She nodded slowly. "Let's fix that," she said. Over the next 2 months, Patricia and I worked quietly and legally to ensure that everything I had built was protected. The business had always been jointly owned. That remained. But the documentation, the paper trail, the structure of our assets, Patricia made sure that if Daniel ever decided to walk away at his mother's urging, he would not be walking away with my life's work tucked under his arm. I didn't tell Daniel. I want to be clear. Everything we did was legal. Everything was above board. I wasn't stealing from him. I was protecting what was mine. There's a difference between those two things, even if they feel uncomfortable in the same sentence. And the whole time I was doing this, I was also pulling on another thread. Because something Margaret had said at dinner 3 weeks earlier had lodged in my mind and wouldn't let go. She'd mentioned, offhand, that she'd been restructuring her portfolio, that she had investors, that things were performing beautifully. I thought about what Daniel had told me years ago, that she'd claimed to have no capital when he needed help. I thought about the lavish life she'd been living while her son ate cereal on a kitchen floor. I started digging. It didn't take long. 4 families, all longtime friends of the Holloways. Combined, they had given Margaret upward of $2 million over 3 years for something she called the Holloway Capital Trust. None of them had received statements. None of them could find a registration. One woman, Karen, the wife of an old family friend, told me she'd asked Margaret about it twice and been smiled at and redirected both times. The trust wasn't registered. It had no licensed advisor. It existed on paper that Margaret controlled, and Margaret alone. I sat with that for 48 hours. Then I called the FBI. Agent Dana Reyes picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. The families, the amounts, the structure, the timeline. I told her I had documentation I could send. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Miss Claire, we've been watching this for over a year." They already had a case. What they needed was someone on the inside, someone who could cooperate without tipping Margaret off, someone with access to communications and timelines. I said yes. I didn't tell Daniel. I know how that sounds. I know there are people who will say I should have, but Daniel was already slipping away from me, already somewhere I couldn't reach him, already listening to a woman who had thrown him out with 2 bags and come back the moment he had something worth taking. If I had told him, one of 2 things would have happened. He would have told his mother, or he would have done nothing. Either way, I would have lost everything. So I carried it alone, the way I had carried most things in my life. The prenup came on a Friday. Margaret called it a formality. She sat across from me in the formal dining room, the dining room of the house I had helped choose, in the life I had helped build, with her attorney beside her and Daniel at the end of the table looking at the wall. The document was 41 pages. My attorney had seen a draft. She'd called me the night before, and her voice was careful and precise. There's a clause that waives your rights to any financial disclosure from the Holloway Family Trust, and another that assigns all jointly held business assets to Daniel in the event of divorce. And a third, Claire, a third clause that prevents you from initiating or cooperating with any third-party financial investigation into family finances. She paused. "She's not just trying to take the assets," Patricia said. "She's trying to silence you before she does it." I closed my eyes. I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want to do?"
I thought about a kitchen floor, cereal, a cracked windshield, 5 years of early mornings and late nights, and every single thing I had chosen to pour into a life with a man who had stopped looking at me like I was worth anything the moment his mother told me I wasn't. I already made the call, I said. So there we were. Margaret, her lawyer, Daniel at the end of the table, the papers in front of me, the pen. She said, "Sign it or leave my son." I set the document down. "Margaret," I said quietly, "before I answer that, there are 2 people at the front door. I think you should answer it." She frowned. "What are you—" The doorbell rang. Daniel got up.
I watched Margaret's face as she heard voices in the entryway. Measured, professional. The kind of voices that don't announce themselves loudly because they don't need to. Daniel appeared in the doorway. He looked at me. Then he looked at his mother. "Mom." His voice was barely above a whisper. "There are 2 FBI agents at the door. They're asking for you." Margaret stood up slowly, and she looked at me. In that look was everything. The prenup, the investors, the years of maneuvering, the months of quietly pulling her son away from the woman who had helped make him. All of it collapsed into a single moment of understanding. She knew. She knew I had known. She knew how long I had been sitting at her dinner table, smiling, while the walls closed in around her. Agent Reyes stepped into the room, calm, unhurried. "Margaret Holloway, we have a warrant. We're going to need you to come with us." Margaret's attorney put a hand on her arm. The prenup sat on the table between us. Nobody signed it. They arrested Margaret and 2 associates that evening. Daniel was not charged. He had not known about the fraud. That much the investigation had confirmed. But standing in his own dining room watching his mother walk out in handcuffs was something that broke something in him that I'm not sure he has fully rebuilt. He turned to me after they left. "You knew," he said. "Yes," I said. "How long?" "Long enough." He looked at me like a stranger, like someone trying to understand a language that had stopped making sense. "You could have told me," he said. And I looked at the man I had loved for 5 years, the man I had built a life with from nothing, the man who had sat in his mother's dining room 3 weeks ago and said, "I'm working on it," in a voice that told me exactly what he was working on. "You stopped being someone I could tell things to," I said, "the moment you started listening to her." I walked upstairs. I packed what I needed that night. Patricia had already filed the necessary documents. The house, the business, the assets, everything was structured. Everything was protected. Everything was mine, legally and cleanly, the way it should have been recognized all along. In the morning, I left. I want to tell you what Daniel lost, because I think it matters. He lost the house we chose together. He lost the business he never could have built without me. He lost the accounts, the investments, the infrastructure of a life that I had been the architect of from the very beginning. He lost all of it, not because I stole it, but because Patricia had made sure that what was mine was documented as mine, and a judge agreed. He went back to an apartment, a smaller life, a reset he hadn't chosen and wasn't prepared for. His mother, facing federal charges, her assets frozen, her reputation destroyed among the very social circles she had sacrificed her son for, moved into a small place on the other side of the city. Mother and son, back together, just like she'd wanted, just without everything that had made it worth wanting. Daniel called me 4 months later. I was sitting on the porch of a new house, smaller than the last one, quieter. Mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. I had my coffee. The morning was still. His name on my screen. I answered, "Claire." His voice was different, hollowed out in a way that 5 years ago I would have moved mountains to fix. "I need you to know that I'm sorry. I know what I did. I know what I let her do. I know I stopped seeing you, and I know what that cost. And I'm so sorry." I let him finish. Then I said, "I believe you, Daniel." A pause, something hopeful stirring in the silence. "I need you to hear that," I said, "because I want you to carry it. I want you to remember exactly what it felt like to have something real and choose every day to look away from it.
I want that to mean something to you going forward." "Claire," he said. "I'm not coming back," I said. "You wanted a life where your mother approved of every piece of it. I hope you find that. I genuinely do." "She's facing federal charges," he said quietly. "She has nothing." "I know, and that is the consequence of what she chose to do, just like this is the consequence of what you chose to do." A long silence. "Is there anything," he said slowly, "anything I could say?" "No," I said, not unkindly, just clearly. "You had 5 years of everything, Daniel. 5 years of someone who showed up every single day. You can't trade that in and then ask for another chance when the new thing falls apart." I heard him breathe. "Take care of yourself," I said. "I mean that." And I hung up.
I sat on that porch for a long time after. I thought about a kitchen floor in a small apartment, cereal for dinner, a cracked windshield, 2 people at the beginning of something, figuring it out together. I thought about what it costs to build a life and what it costs to walk away from one. I thought about Margaret, somewhere across the city in a small apartment, stripped of everything she'd spent years accumulating, alone in the way that people who push everyone away eventually are. I don't hate her. I've thought about whether I should, and I've decided it's not worth the energy. She was a woman who let fear run her life. Fear of being left behind, fear of being irrelevant, fear of watching her son belong more to someone else than to her. That fear made her do terrible things, and those terrible things cost her everything. That is its own justice. I didn't need to add to it. What I needed was exactly what I had: a quiet morning, a porch that was wine, coffee going cold in my hands, a life I had built, and this time, built for myself. I'm Claire. I live in Tennessee now. I run the business, my business, with a team of 7 people who show up every day and work hard and don't owe their loyalty to anyone's mother. I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who has been building since before you noticed her. If this story hit something in you, I want to know. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what you felt. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me if you've ever sat across from someone who tried to take what you built and felt that quiet in your chest that means you already know how it ends. I read every comment, every single one. And if you made it all the way here and you're not subscribed yet, you already know you need to be. Hit that button. There are more stories coming. And somewhere out there, someone needed to hear this one today.